I am a security guard at NASA. I entered an off-limits room, and it was the greatest mistake of my life. I work as a night watchman. I operate in a building owned by a government agency. They specialize in science and research related to space exploration. I work the night shift. This profession and the location-specific gig have been my main source of income now for 2 years. I have generally had nothing but enthusiasm for my job. The reason I was a candidate is because of my experience as a combat veteran. I had already proven that I was trustworthy to keep secrets. Things seen and heard that most of the population is not exposed to was far from new for me. In the first 6 months, I received training on how to check on every major part of the headquarters. I could not believe the freedom of mobility my superiors gave me. They issued my first master key, and my retinal scan was in their system. I patrolled a building divided into 4 sections. These were aeronautics research, human exploration and operations, science, and space technology. The science sector was further split into 4 more wings. They were astrophysics, earth science, heliophysics, and planetary science. I entered areas usually restricted from the public. I signed non-disclosure agreements swearing the utmost confidentiality. After these steps, I could go anywhere on the property. A lifetime of being an avid fan of Carl Sagan made me appreciate my access to everything. Granted, I was always on camera whenever I stepped into any of the main areas, so even if I did have an interest in bringing anything home with me, there was little to no chance I would get away with it. There was one titanium door I was not allowed to walk through, though. There was no label on its front, so I knew it was not an office belonging to any executive. There was also no surveillance camera in the vicinity focused on the door. I always wondered what was behind there. I can remember asking my trainer what the room held, and he moved on to a different topic. I did not press the issue. I was too new. I always wanted to ask somebody else, but on the graveyard shift, there was rarely anyone else there with me. I was the only security personnel. None of the top brass would be present during the ridiculous hours I kept. I came to form a semi-close relationship with one of the surveillance agents named Tom. He would usually clock in around 7 a.m. During brief morning moments, we established a rapport. I once asked him what was behind the door. I even had Starbucks delivered in an attempt to bribe him. It was once used as an archive of various life forms found in the ocean, he said with a shrug. Not completely sure. It's used for discarded down parts that engineering has no use for it anymore if I had to guess. One night I walked by the door. Everything was completely silent. I would break policy and listen to a podcast through Bluetooth while doing my checks. On this particular night, I was enjoying nothing more than the sound of my footsteps as I paced the halls. That was when I heard a scream. I slammed my fists on the door. I announced myself as trained if they needed help. Everything became quiet again. I contemplated what I should do. Giving my director a call and asking for further guidance was a surefire way to irritate him. Still, my conscience did not tolerate the notion of ignoring a cry for help. My mind always went to the worst-case scenario. I retrieved my cell phone and called someone of higher rank. At first, he listened to my recounting. Once I gave him the geographical location of the entranceway, his tone changed. He became dismissive. "It's creaky pipes," he said. "Put in a work order for the maintenance team to take a look at it in the morning." My curiosity would not go away. I wondered if detainees from foreign lands were there, or it was something far more insidious than even I could imagine. My paranoia only grew. One morning when Tom walked in, I pulled him to the side. We spoke in a vestibule which led to a computer room. "Part of my job consists of taking out the trash from every office during my shift," I said. "There's been many times when I've noticed that your wastebasket is empty, and I know it's not for the lack of paperwork you do. I know you've been stealing some files. I usually look the other way because I want to give you the benefit of the doubt and I respect you." He looked at me with a dumbfounded expression. He tried to utter something around a bunch of nervous stutters. I interrupted him and continued. "The door that no one seems to know anything about has some sort of very real significance. I also don't believe that there are no surveillance cameras in that hallway. I think it's hidden, and if that's the case, I need you to secure it for when I enter it tonight. I need your help getting a master key to it, which I know you have. If you don't, then I'll report my findings." My blackmail worked. He slipped me a key with a handshake later on in the morning before I left for home. I had every intention of using it as soon as I could. I waited until the dead of night. The middle of my shift was the prime hours for isolation. I would exploit the lack of oversight on my shift. I took unusual routes to get to the door. I knew the action I was about to take could cost me my job. It seemed like the right thing to do. I slipped the card into the motion sensor. It blinked red at first and then turned a bright green. If they ever did a reading of the entries and exits for that lock, it would read the name of another employee. I knew it was not my friend Tom's. I wondered how long he had been pilfering such top-tier company-related property. The door cracked open. When I walked in, the chamber was completely black. I took a few more steps in. I found a fluorescent overhead light that illuminated the area with each step I took. A siren went off. The shriek made me feel as though my eardrums were about to burst. I looked around to see if any strobe lights were spinning, but did not see any. I turned around and saw another lock on the inside of the room. It was near a metal slab that held stacks of manila envelopes. I put the key into it, and the alarm ceased. Although I had made the trouble signal evaporate, I still expected men with guns drawn to crash in. I expected shouted orders to get down and surrender. I had a nightmarish vision of someone putting a black bag over my head. I knew they would bring me to a secret prison on an island in the middle of nowhere. I gazed around the room. Everything seemed primitive. There were large machines that looked as though they came off of a battleship from the 80s. They were rust-covered and grimy. There were so many metallic, spindly, and industrial contraptions. Cobwebs and dust blanketed everything. In each corner of the ceiling were large speakers, and they were not a brand I recognized. It seemed as though they were custom built for this place. I turned the corner and peered into the adjacent room. I could not believe what I saw. A podium with illustrations of seraphim wings stood in the center of the domain. A circular glass encasement wrapped around the top. I approached it and peered through the translucent barrier. A horrible smell greeted me. I found another slot. I used the key once more to get the glass to retract and fold so I could see the contents on top of the slab. It was a thick stack of yellow legal pads. Each page contained finely printed chunks of text in fine calligraphic handwriting. I began reading from the top. I flipped through the pages. I found the author to be a well-known scientist I had small interactions with regularly. Within the last few months, the document began, I have received a series of acoustic sound waves. The scales I used to track their sonic trajectories gave me accurate measurements. I have determined that it comes from the asteroid Icarus. These readings make it even more difficult to capture. Their erratic and unpredictable distances are challenging. They formulated actual syllables, albeit unfamiliar ones. Their sound was guttural and diaphragmatic. There was a strange aggressiveness to the vocal cord projection. I transcribed each one painstakingly. I ran everyone through an archive database to see if there were any matches. My decision to do so was random and experimental with the lowest of expectations. What I discovered is they did form a language from here on Earth. It was one created by English Renaissance occultists John Dee and Edward Kelly. I gulped before I continued to the next paragraph. Very little fazed me, but something about the paranormal always left me uneasy. The tellings of jinn and ghosts in Afghanistan resonated with me. So did the evidence of curses after hard-fought battles which desecrated sacred sites. When translated, the text is cohesive in its narrative form. It follows a linear structure and manages to be comprehensive. It tells a very familiar tale for anyone who ever went to Sunday school. It is a first-person perspective story about an entity that claims to be a fallen angel. The angelic creatures, benevolent or malevolent, ended up exiled from their original galaxy. They stress the pure destructiveness of their power. They compare their threat level to Luciferian influence. I continued flipping through the pages. There was a variety of strange charts and glyphs scattered throughout. I went down to open one of the cupboards at the bottom of the podium and knocked the whole thing over. The scientist's body lay there in a crumpled position. His innards seeped out of his stomach. The carvings on his flesh resembled angel wings. My son's camera monitor alerted in the middle of the night. I checked it and saw my wife and son sitting on the bed. They weren't my wife and son. I'm a nurse and I currently work nights. It's a total drag, but I'm hopeful I can go to days soon since some coworkers are planning retirements. Anyway, I was working one night when just after 3 a.m. my son's monitor alerted me to sound and movement. No big deal at all. He probably coughed loudly or sneezed or something. He's 3 now, so he generally sleeps all night. I bring it up on my phone and I see him and my wife sitting on the bed. Again, no big deal. He might have cried out or gotten scared or something. I was about to close the app when I noticed they were acting strange, almost creepy. And when I say almost creepy, I mean creepy as balls. They were sitting on the bed together, both of them just staring up at the camera with blank, emotionless stares. The night vision is black and white, so they had white, eerie-looking eyes. They didn't move at all aside from their visible breathing. They just sat there staring at the camera. I close the app and give my wife a call to make sure everything is okay. I never get to call home on lunch, so in a way this is kind of nice to get to talk to my family while at work. It rings a couple times before she answers with a very groggy hello. It was like she was dead asleep when I called and she looked wide awake when on the camera. Hey, you guys okay? Huh, yeah. Buddy came in like 15 minutes ago. Seemed scared, so I said he could sleep with Mama. I'm confused here since I saw them in his room a minute ago. Literally 60 seconds had passed since I closed the app and made the call. Wait, so you guys are in bed? Yeah, I fell back asleep right away. Everything okay? Everybody keeps waking me up. She's kind of annoyed. Hang on a sec. I put her on speaker and bring up the app, hoping I don't see it. When the app loads, I get that pang of intense nervousness in my stomach that I haven't had in a long time, since I was a kid in school and realized while I was eating breakfast a paper or something was due that day and I hadn't done it. My heart leaps into my throat. My wife and son are sitting on his bed looking up at the camera, same emotionless stares. Hello, you guys are in bed, right? Yeah, we're trying to sleep. Well, I'm looking at his camera and I see you two sitting on his bed. Huh, no, we're in our bed. I know that's what you mean, but I'm looking at his bed and you two are in there. Hang on, she says. She's quiet for a sec while she brings up the camera on her phone. I hear this guttural, terrified gasp, like she had sucked all the air in the room into her lungs, filling them to capacity. I don't hear this kind of gasp from my wife often, usually only when she's truly afraid, like during a jump scare in a movie or one time when we turned her back on our son for literally a second and he was down by the mailbox inches from the road. I hear rustling of sheets and the line goes dead. Of course, now I'm absolutely terrified myself, so I immediately call back. It goes to voicemail, so I call again. I call again and again with no answer. Finally, after about 4 minutes, she calls me. I tell you that 4 minutes felt like 40 years. Hey, what's happening? I ask. She's absolutely hysterical and crying. I can't understand a word she says. Stop. Slow down for just a second, I say. She slows down enough to explain they are in the car and driving to her parents. She looked at the camera and when she saw what was on it, she got up and grabbed our son and rushed downstairs and out the door. Didn't even close the garage. Don't worry about it, I said. I'll drive by when I get off and close it. We live in a generally safe neighborhood, so I'm not too concerned the door is up. You will not go in there, she says. Hell no, I return. Why are we on the camera? She asked. Is it a recording? I don't know, I return. I'm gonna keep watching it and see if there's anything I can tell. Do our code words with Buddy. We have code words because we're nerds. We've seen too many pod people and imposter movies, so we decided a long time ago to make code words with each other to be able to tell if one of us was an imposter. We have a couple code words, but we also have a 3-sentence story we recite together, each saying a different part alternately of each other. I hear her on the phone saying the things we taught our son. He giggles as he says them since he thinks they're a joke and doesn't have any idea of the real meaning. We're both convinced he's our son. My wife then says our part and I'm convinced she's her. We made up these words as a complete joke to ourselves. I never once in my life ever imagined we'd actually need them. Unreal. She got to her parents safely and it was hard to hang up. I told her we'll figure it out in the morning, hopefully just a glitch. She said she didn't think it was a glitch. When she was running out, she had to run by our son's room and the door was open. There's a little flashing light on the back of the camera that indicates it's connected to the internet. It gives off just enough light that when she ran by, she thought she saw, out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy outline of what could have been an adult sitting on our son's bed. It sends chills down my spine to think about. Knowing they were safe and out of the house is the only thing that kept me at work that night. It was a long 4 hours, but I kept checking the camera every chance I got. Sure enough, they were still sitting on the bed staring up at the camera with emotionless gazes. I studied them to see if I could see any pattern, from their breathing to their blinking. Their breathing was steady and looked normal. It was their blinking that would tell me if this was just some kind of bizarre, time-loop freak accident video or not. I intently stare at my phone and count the seconds between each blink, telling myself if this is a loop then their blinks should be even and occur at the same time each time. There was no pattern to their blinking, it was erratic and random, just as a person blinking should be. The passing hours are what finally sealed the deal that this was not a weird loop video of some kind. My son's window is visible on camera and I can see on camera that it is getting lighter outside his room. His curtains keep out just enough light to prevent the camera from exiting night vision, but lets in just enough to be able to tell the sun is rising. I try to figure out what the hell I'm going to do before I leave work. Calling the police comes to mind, but I talk myself out of it. First of all, what am I supposed to say? Someone is in my house that looks like my wife but isn't. Worse yet, what if they are entities of some kind and the police do go over and it kills them or something? I decide to tell coworker about it. He's a firm believer in the paranormal and might have a suggestion. I show him the video and tell him the story. His initial response of "that's creepy as fuck" doesn't help much, but he says he wants to go over and check it out. He says we both should to see if not my wife will try and act like my wife. I tell him absolutely not and he says we should at least go to the house even if we don't go in. I agree on that since I wanted to close the garage. We got to my house and walked around the perimeter first. Not sure what we wanted to accomplish by that, but it felt like something we should do. The curtains were all drawn since nobody was there to open them in the morning, so we couldn't see anything. I went to close the garage and suddenly had this overwhelming urge to go inside and investigate. It was like I just had to know what was going on. So in we went. We walked through the kitchen towards the foyer where the stairs are. It's so quiet in our house right now you could hear a feather drop, forget the pin. We stop at the bottom of the stairs and wait a few seconds. I look at the camera again and they are still sitting there. I've never been so scared in my life. My coworker puts his foot on the first step and I suddenly say stop loudly. Forget this, we're out of here, I tell him. Come on, I start making my way back to the kitchen. We hear a loud creak in the floor from upstairs. It's my son's room. He has a very loud, creaky board right in the middle of his floor that's almost impossible not to step on. My wife and are still deciding if we ever want to fix it because it will alert us if he's ever up to no good when he gets older trying to sneak out or something. Come on, come on, come on. I yell as I motion for him to move his ass. We're out of the house in about 2 seconds. Out on the street I check my phone. Now only not my son was sitting on the bed, same blank stare. Not my wife was gone. Holy shit, my coworker says. That was stupid as fuck of us. Do not tell my wife we went inside. She would be so ungodly mad if she found out what we just did. I use my garage door opener in my car to close the door. Before we leave I look at the camera again. Not my wife is back on the bed with not my son, both staring blankly up at the camera, blinking every few seconds. That was all about 4 days ago now. Not my wife and not my son are still sitting on the bed staring up at the camera. They haven't moved a millimeter. We obviously haven't gone back to our house. What do? I volunteered to sit next to a dead man on a plane and deeply regret it. The man in seat 43 had died halfway across the Atlantic. I was sitting near the front of the plane, just behind first class, and couldn't really see the commotion. But I could hear someone gasping and retching, loud at first, then quieter and quieter. A flight attendant got on the PA and asked for any medical professionals among the passengers to help. I guess there were none. After a few minutes, the man's sounds deteriorated into a sort of gurgle, then silence, then it was over. His name was Molyneux, and he was old but not that old, and it was likely a heart attack, aneurysm, drug reaction, or God's will, according to conflicting and hand reports that filtered down the plane from row 43, where a flight attendant simply buckled the newly deceased back into his window seat and covered his face with a complimentary airline blanket. The pilot got on the intercom and told us the plane would be turning back to New York due to a tragic medical situation involving one of our passengers. Folks, we're looking for a volunteer willing to sit next to the deceased while we return to our originating airport, the pilot continued. This flight is entirely full, and the person sitting there now isn't feeling comfortable. It's an aisle seat, and it will only be a few hours before we're back over land. I'm not sure why I volunteered, probably some combination of exhaustion, altruism, and morbid curiosity. My vacation plans were shot anyway, I figured, so why not take the most interesting seat on the plane? The flight attendant thanked me profusely, as did a queasy-looking teenager who took my original seat. I picked up my handbag and shuffled down the aisle to the very last row of the plane. My only prior experience with corpses was an open casket funeral for my grandmother when I was a kid, but the idea of death had never particularly bothered me. It's natural, after all. That said, I admit that I second-guessed my decision as soon as I saw my new seatmate. Mr. Molyneux, rest in peace, sat upright between the window and me, strapped around the waist, with a blue fleece blanket covering his torso and head. The blanket did not cover his hands, which were resting on his lap above his seatbelt, placed that way by a flight attendant as a sign of respect, I assumed. Molyneux's pale fingers were twisted into claws that betrayed the agony of his death. I couldn't look at those hands without imagining what his face looked like under the blanket. I thought of asking for a second blanket, but the flight crew was still busy calming down other passengers and preparing for our U-turn around the Atlantic Ocean. So I tried to forget my uneasiness and closed my eyes and slept. I woke, hours or minutes later, I don't know, to the jostling of turbulence. The cabin lights were off and most of the passengers around me seemed to be sleeping. I looked out the window, trying not to look at Molyneux as I did so, and saw only the uniform blackness of the night. I imagined the ocean miles below us, lightless and cold. The thought unsettled me and I reached across Molyneux to close the window shade. Then I stopped myself. Hadn't the shade been closed when I sat down? I realized there was something else off about the scene. Molyneux's posture had somehow changed while I slept. It took me a few seconds to pinpoint it. His gnarled hands remained on his lap, he was still belted at the waist, and the blanket still shrouded his upper body. But the fabric looked somehow twisted now, as if he had been fidgeting. Very slowly, knowing it was insane even as I knew I couldn't stop myself, I lifted a corner of the blanket. I uncovered his shirt, which the flight crew had unbuttoned while trying to save him. A patch of blue-gray skin sprouting white chest hair peeked out from it. I lifted the blanket higher. His collar was flecked with dried blood. I remembered his terrible gasping. Finally, I pulled the blanket entirely off and stifled a scream. Molyneux's head was turned away from me, exactly as if he had turned to stare out the window. I could see his face reflected in the plexiglass. It was undoubtedly a dead man's face, pale, drawn, lips parted, jaw slack. There was no life in it, except his eyes. They were moving. I stared at the reflection for half a minute and I'm sure of it. In the center of that death mask, two pupils flicked back and forth, as if tracking something out there in the sky. "What are you doing?" A voice beside me interrupted. I whipped around and saw the woman seated across the aisle staring at me, not so much in fear as disgust. "Cover him back up. Give him his peace." I think he's been moving," I stammered. "His eyes. I think he might not actually be." But I couldn't finish the sentence, it was too crazy. Nor did I have to, because at that moment my stomach dropped 10 feet along with everything else in the plane. Coffee cups and purses slammed against the ceiling. A man near the first-class section nearly tumbled out of his seat. I heard call lights going off all over the plane as passengers were jolted awake in panic and confusion. "Passengers, please take your seats, buckle in, and secure any loose items," the pilot said over the PA, sounding shaken himself. "The weather along our flight path is clear and no planes in the area are reporting turbulence, so I'm not sure what this is. But we should be through it momentarily." Even as he spoke, the mild background shaking I'd felt since waking up became noticeably more violent. The woman across the aisle began fumbling for her seatbelt, no longer paying any attention to me or Molyneux. I forced myself to look at him again. The jolt must have caused him to pitch forward at the waist, his head colliding with the seat in front of him. But Molyneux's face was still turned toward the window, his neck twisted at such a sharp angle that I worried it had snapped. I looked at his hands again, and the pallor of his skin. 3 flight attendants and a dozen passengers had witnessed this man's death, and I could not rationally imagine they were mistaken. And yet in the reflection of the window, his eyes left to right, left to right. I had heard that strange reflexes sometimes kick in after death, limbs flailing, headless chickens running, nerves clearing out the last backlog of instructions from the brain. But the eyes, I had never heard of that. I made myself look past that unsettling reflection at the sky itself. It was still dark, moonless and cloudless, but the atmosphere seemed to have taken on a strange hue, a very dark green, like pea soup fog. I thought I could see vague shapes swirling around in the murk, though it might have been an optical illusion. I recoiled. I desperately wanted to be anywhere else right then, but the rest of the cabin was approaching a state of pandemonium. Flight attendants were hurrying up and down the aisles, attending to spills and bruises, even as they tripped and staggered. The entire plane was shuddering like a barrel going down the rapids. A series of jolts sent Molyneux's upper body swinging back and forth like an upside-down pendulum. He was thrown backward into his seat, then sideways into me, and then the opposite way, his face slamming directly into the window, where it came to rest. That was enough for me. I unbuckled, leapt out of my seat and locked myself in the bathroom directly behind me. I would cower on a toilet for the rest of this hellish flight rather than spend another minute sitting with Mr. Molyneux. This plan worked for a half hour or so. I braced both my arms against the bathroom's walls and listened to the chimes of flight attendant call buttons, the whine of jet engines and the growling of the sky. I tried to calm myself by visualizing the skyline of New York, the JFK airstrip, a calm descent. But then I imagined Molyneux's window, his face mashed up against the glass like a little boy's, his dead eyes searching the night. The captain's disembodied voice called me back to reality. He sounded outright scared now, and the PA kept cutting in and out. Extremely anomalous weather. Need everyone in their seats in the emergency position. Immediately, if we depressurize. The turbulence stopped for 4 or 5 seconds, and then suddenly it felt like I was inside a washing machine. I bounced against the walls of the bathroom, landed on the floor, and could barely manage to get the door open and crawl on all fours into the aisle. All 3 flight attendants were down, sprawled on backs and bellies between the seats. Some of the overhead luggage bins had burst open and spewed baggage out. Many of the passengers were weeping. A few prayed. And through it all, the plane would not stop shaking. I heard a series of small bangs above my head and felt something wet on my cheek. Every single soda can in the galley had exploded. I climbed into my seat and belted myself in, having briefly forgotten about Molyneux and my terror. Thwack thwack. But he was still in his seat, of course, whipping back and forth like a flagpole in a hurricane, head butting the window so hard that I could see the plexiglass balloon outwards and rebound each time. Thwack. I became worried he'd crack the window, though that's supposed to be impossible, so I overcame my revulsion and grabbed his shoulders. But I couldn't restrain him. Again and again, his head hit the window. I began to fear that it was not simply the motion of the plane that compelled him. Thwack thwack thwack. No one else on the plane was watching this. Some of the passengers had rallied and were trying to pull the injured flight attendants out of the aisle. Others were whispering goodbye messages into their phones. Thwack thwack krkrrrrr. I heard something crack beside me and hoped desperately that it was Molyneux's skull and not the window. Outside I could see that the green fog was alive with swirling, amorphous shapes. Thwack krkrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr managed to smash out both window panes in one final blow. Now his mangled head was hanging outside the plane, and the rest of his body was straining to follow it, restrained only by his seatbelt and the width of his shoulders. An alarm went off in the cabin, and a jungle of oxygen masks fell from the ceilings. I put mine on at once, but heard other people screaming. Some passengers were trying desperately to get masks on the unconscious air crew, but the plane was shaking more violently than ever, and loose debris was flying up the aisles toward my row, toward the hole a dead man had made in the airplane. "Cabin breach," said the pilot. "Limited backup oxygen, so I'm trying to descend to a safe altitude. But hard to do that in this storm, or whatever it is. God be with us." Once I was sure that I could breathe and was in danger of being sucked out myself, I took one last look at Molyneux. His head might have torn clean off outside the window, for all I could see of it past the rest of his body. I pictured those eyes again, which had seen something in the sky that we had not seen, could not see, even as it now threatened to shake the plane apart. There was some connection between these events that I might never understand. But even without understanding, I could make the last move available to me. I reached over Molyneux's lap, lifted one of those cold, clawed hands, and unclasped his seatbelt. There was an intolerable crunching noise as, I presume, his shoulders were squeezed and crushed to fit the window frame. And then in a split second he was gone, out the window, into the night, a pale old man falling end over end toward the black ocean. "Whatever you saw out there," I whispered. "Whatever you were looking for, go to it and leave us be." The green fog lifted a few minutes later, and the plane descended until it was safe to breathe without the masks. Less than an hour later, I really did see the JFK airstrip. A whole squadron of police and ambulances met us on the way down. The flight attendants and several passengers had to be hospitalized, but as far as I know, no one suffered serious injuries. Federal investigators eventually concluded that we had flown through a localized weather anomaly, witnessed by no other plane in the sky that night. Some sort of debris must have been flying around up there with us and taken out the window at 43A, they wrote in their report. This event led to a sudden loss of cabin pressure, in which the body of a passenger who had died earlier in an unrelated medical emergency was ejected from the plane. I expected to hear a lot more about it on the news, but I suppose in the end it was just one of those things. The airline had no interest in publicizing the incident, of course, and the passengers had no desire to relive it. For most people on the flight, it was simply a freak tragedy followed by a close call, and all's well that ends well. I'm the only one that will dream for the rest of my life about Molyneux's eyes and what they saw on the way to the ocean. I killed something invisible and I don't know what to do. For weeks, I knew I was being stalked. Everything I'd meticulously sorted by color had been sifted through and returned out of order, unwrinkled, but changed, and they felt different, like they'd been washed with the wrong detergent or touched with soapy hands. But it wasn't just that. There was a wrongness in my apartment. The floor creaked randomly. One day I found a large handprint on my mirror that hadn't been there when I left for work in the morning. There was an odor, too, one I'd only smelled at funeral homes before. Then one night I woke up to the feeling of hot breath in my face, like a dog was inches away, panting at me. I sat up and heard a thump and something landed on my floor. "Go away," I screamed as footsteps retreated into the distance. I turned on all the lights and found the room empty, but I never did go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of bed and felt a sharp pain in my foot. Looking down, I found a sharp, needle-like object embedded in the floor. I took it to the bathroom to look at it under stronger light and realized that the needle turned transparent when viewed from certain angles. I tried to look online, but I couldn't find anything like the needle. Then, in the middle of my next search, my router went out. The sounds mostly came at night, but then things started happening in the daytime too. A pair of my running sneakers disappeared right after a jog. And then, when I was showering, I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God, you're so beautiful." I screamed and screamed and screamed. The next morning, I bought a gun. The guy at the store, a bearded fatherly type, tried to sell me on a 9mm that looked like a toy, but I sprung for a Sig Sauer 365, complete with a 10+1 magazine. I hadn't gone shooting since my dad had taken me to the range back in my teens, so I figured I might need a few shots. That night, I slipped the gun under my pillow and went to sleep. I woke up to the feeling of someone stroking my bare shoulder. My hips felt pinned to the mattress. I cried out in panic and pushed up as hard as I could. I heard a grunt, and then something grabbed my wrists and pushed me down. I felt the wet of lips on mine. Then I swung my knee up and felt it collide with something soft. I heard a groan, and then something thumped on the hardwood beside the bed. I reached over, grabbed my gun, and shot at the groan until my clip was half empty. There was a hacking cough, and then a voice begging, "Wait, please, don't, I love you." I emptied the rest of the clip and the voice was gone. There's a warm wet pool on my bedroom floor now. I've been trying to mop it up, but it's hard because there's nothing to see. Then there's the invisible thing. It's a little bigger than me, and I'm not sure how I'll possibly lift it. A few minutes ago, as I was looking for my mop in the garage, another strange thing happened. My front door slowly opened and closed. I heard a few sets of footsteps enter. They walked to my bedroom. Since then, I've been hearing the sound of tape unrolling and bottles spraying. They're cleaning up, I realize, but what I don't yet know is if I'm part of the mess.